Sergey Grigoriev was the quintessential mountain man that we only see on TV. He'd grown up on the outskirts of Ozerk, Russia, on a small plot of land where he and his family grew all of their own food. Sergey's brother and two sisters grew up and moved away to the city, studying to become nurses and a mechanic. But Sergey knew since he was a boy that he'd never leave the grounds on which he was born. He lived for the woods and the fresh air. All he needed was a rifle to bring home dinner and to make some money on the side by selling the massive musk oxens that he had become so good at tracking. Occasionally he sold fur from animals he'd caught in one of his traps. Sergey was alone with his two dogs that he'd found abandoned during his excursions in the forest, and they were enough to keep him company. But Sergey also had another more unusual pet, a brown bear named Vorchun, which translates to grumbler. The 4-year-old bear was one of two cubs that Sergey found hiding in the hollow of a boulder after he was forced to shoot their mother when she attacked him while he was out collecting lynxes from his traps. He named the other brother Kosaka, meaning biter. For a while, Sergey kept them in a cage that he'd built with his own hands while looking for places that would take them. Kosaka found a home soon enough, and Grumbler nearly did too. But when Sergey found out that the people who were interested in Grumbler wanted to use him as live bait to train hunting dogs, he pulled out of the deal and kept him instead. He just couldn't bear the thought of the creature being treated in such a cruel way. Sergey's siblings came to visit him often at their old childhood home, and they'd long since accepted his eccentric and unusual way of living. But even they thought that the bear was taking it too far. Of all people, Sergey should have known better than to keep such an unpredictable animal as a pet. But Sergey shrugged off their warnings. Grumble had the freedom to walk where he pleased and only ever slept in his cage until he turned 2 years old. But soon Sergey was forced to keep him in his cage after the nearly fully grown bear became angry with one of Sergey's dogs. Sergey jumped between the animals and got a nasty scratch across his chest for his troubles. But it became clear that Grumbler's freedom had to be reined in if Sergey hoped to keep all of his pets alive. After that, Grumbler was only allowed out if he was chained to the collar he wore around his neck. And for the next 2 years, all was well in Sergey's little patch of the woods, though his sisters refused to bring their children around to visit after the incident. By late December 2018, the snow was several feet deep, and the winter was in its deepest throes. Like every winter, Sergey and his odd collection of pets kept to the property, since hunting opportunities are virtually non-existent in the brutal Russian winters. Sergey and his closest neighbor, Dmitry, had a standing arrangement to have tea with each other at least once a month. When Dmitry braved the snow for his monthly visit, he noticed that Grumbler was pacing in frustration in his cage. He even told Sergey that the animal was surely out of his mind with confusion. Brown bears hibernated during this time, and everything in Grumbler's being was telling him to go off into the woods to find a quiet cave to lay down in for the winter. But like always, Sergey shrugged the warnings off. As soon as Dmitry left, Sergey decided that Grumbler probably just needed to stretch his legs to get rid of some of those winter jitters. He had been bad-tempered since the snow started to fall. He picked up the chain and walked out, whistling for Grumbler's attention. When the creature heard the call, he came bounding to the gate of his cage. But Grumbler had no intention of walking around on a leash. He wanted to go into the forest that was calling for him. Sergey tied the long chain to a post inside the cage, attached the other end to Grumbler's neck, and opened the gate so that he could walk a few yards out into the snow. But the moment that the chain pulled tight, Grumbler began to struggle with it. He wanted to go, to run, and to be free to do as his instincts told him. The wooden post began to creak and whine against the massive pull from the half-ton beast that was straining to rip it out of the ground. Sergey ran forwards when he saw what was about to happen, and just as the post exploded out of the snow in a shower of frozen ground, he grabbed onto the chain as Grumble was about to leap forward. Grumble's head snapped back when Sergey took hold of the chain, and instinctively, without even looking what the cause of his halt was, the animal turned around and charged towards Sergey. His massive paw hit Sergey right across his chest. caving in his sternum with a sickening crack. Sergey flew through the air, hitting the snow several feet away. His two dogs stormed out of the house the moment they heard the commotion. Had they not come out when they did, barking and snarling to protect their beloved human, Grumble might have even been able to regain his senses, but the two snarling and hysterical dogs just sent him deeper into madness. Sergey was still gasping for air. The crushed bone plate over his chest was compressing his lungs, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Grumble swiped at one of the dogs, sending him crashing into the fence of the cage where it lay unconscious, and charged at the fallen man. This time Grumble only saw red. He was out to destroy anything and everything that stood in its path, and that included the man and the second dog that was protectively keeping guard over him. Sergey saw stars in front of his eyes as the lack of air began to get the better of him. He couldn't see what was going on, but he sure heard the horrible sounds of his precious mutt being ripped to shreds. When the bear cast the dead canine aside, all its attention turned on Sergey. It bit into Sergey's head, pulling him up by the scalp and tearing at the man's body with its claws. In seconds, Sergey went limp. Even in his blind madness, Grumble realized that the man was dead and threw him aside just like he did to the dogs, before running off into the wilderness. Once Grumble ran away most of his fury, he finally came to a standstill. He needed to go into the wild, but he had no idea what to do now that he was finally there. He'd never had to seek shelter. He didn't know how to feed himself, and in the dead of winter he was as lost as a child would be. It took him 2 days to find his home again, where Sergey and his loyal dog's bodies now lay frozen. The second dog had regained consciousness and was cowering in the house, his ribs badly bruised. Before long, Grumble ate the only thing available, Sergey. By the time Sergey's family and his neighbor realized that he wasn't answering his phone, Grumble had 2 weeks to strip Sergey down to the bone, and he'd moved on to the dog. It was one of Sergey's sisters, Maria, who finally found his remains. Grumble was still pacing in the yard, protecting what was left of the corpse. When she saw the red smears on the white snow and the pile of remains, she got back into her car just as Grumble stormed at her and her madly barking dog. It took authorities 2 days before they could track down Grumble, shooting him where he was hiding in the trees. And miraculously, the dog inside the house was still alive, nearly starved to death and completely traumatized from the ordeal. Maria took him in. He was all she had left of her brother, but the family home remained in the woods, still standing there to this day, slowly decaying more and more as winter comes, streaming through the open doors every winter since Sergei Grigoriev's terrifying final affliction. Kellyanne and Michael Walls lived on a picturesque property set on a hilltop, surrounded by friendly neighbors who they got along very well with. Looking at the pair, you'd never suspect them of being different from any other married couple. But in reality, they had a very unusual hobby. Michael and Kellyanne liked to collect animals, and not just any animals. They had an affinity for exotic predators. You'd think that the neighbors would be worried about all of these murderous creatures in such close proximity to their homes and children. But according to them, the Wallses were excellent pet owners. Their cages were sturdy and secure. They had all of the proper licensing, and they passed every annual inspection of their property. The neighbors even made a game of spooking their visitors with the roars that echoed across the outskirts of Ross Township, Pennsylvania. In 1994, Michael procured a license to house exotic animals from across the seas, and they spent the next few years slowly filling their property with all sorts of dangerous meat eaters that could growl the pants off even the bravest men. A lion, 2 serval cats, a jaguar, a tiger, and a leopard. But their biggest and most loved animal was a fully grown black bear by the name of Teddy. Michael had the paperwork that gave him the right to sell and trade the animals that they kept. He could have even charged the public to visit his property like a mini zoo, but that wasn't what Michael and Kellyanne were about. They just adored creatures that would normally scare the rest of us senseless. They saw the beauty in them where others couldn't. and if the neighbors were ever worried, well, they were encouraged to come and inspect the property themselves. The couple loved nothing more than to share their love for wild animals with their acquaintances, and their community found the pair and all of their animals quite charming. Even their next-door neighbor, Scott Castone, who had 2 young children, spoke very highly of the Walses and what stellar animal keepers they were. He never once worried that the carnivorous cats would escape. Scott inspected their cages himself, and he visited his friends all the time, often bringing his own kids along. But it would be this very complacency that was to blame for the events that unfolded on that fateful day of October 2009. Kellyanne herself raised Teddy since he was a cub, and the couple spoiled him with treats and attention. Teddy's favorite snack was popcorn, and he was Kellyanne's pride and joy. Teddy was 350 pounds of pure muscle that was kept behind a 15 by 15 foot steel and concrete cage. In nature, black bears aren't exactly known for their tolerance of humans, but the handful that have been kept by people are reported to be much more mild-mannered than grizzlies. Unless it comes to food and their young, then black bears are just as likely as any other wild animal to get aggressive. It's just in their natures, and no amount of training can override natural instinct. And to bring an even more serious tone to this situation, Teddy was even bigger than his kind normally grew to be. He had always been fed the best food. He never had to fight to survive, and he had never known sickness or hard times. Teddy was a black bear in his prime. Not only was he unimaginably strong and heavy, he stood at a height that was twice as tall as a man. The 6th of October was a Sunday, and the day started off cold and wet. A typical muggy fall morning in Pennsylvania, and a typical day for Kelly. After Michael left for the day, she and her own 2 children headed out bright and early to feed their many animals. Sunday was also the day that Kelly cleaned all of the cages on their land, so this was going to be a long and busy morning for her. Her first stop was always Teddy's cage. Kelly never missed a day where she didn't greet her beloved Teddy first. Kelly waved to her neighbor Scott over the fence. He was already up and about with his own 2 children, tending to some odd jobs around his house that he'd been putting off all week. Scott's kids waved hello to their friends before turning back to help their father. Kelly's children hung back on the porch. The night's sleep hadn't quite left them, and they were still too groggy to show much enthusiasm for the day just yet. But Kelly didn't mind. She loved spending her mornings with the animals, and most of all, with Teddy. She rode the wheelbarrow right to the edge of the cage's door. She needed to shovel up Teddy's messes before laying down some fresh straw to keep his paws clear of the muddy ground. But before she entered the cage, Teddy got a shovelful of food. That shovel wasn't going to be enough to fill the gigantic bear's stomach, but it was enough to keep him occupied while she wheeled her tools in through the door. It's not like she wanted to keep Teddy occupied enough to ignore herself. He'd never shown any aggression toward Kelly after all. But she did want to keep Teddy busy enough not to notice the open door. The bear wouldn't hesitate to leave his enclosure if he was given half the chance. But food was an even bigger incentive than freedom, so Teddy never even bothered to look up from his breakfast while Kelly got busy. Teddy knew the drill by now, and he was excitedly awaiting his treat. Standing on his hind legs, he pawed at the cage and growled a deep good morning to his owner. Teddy was going through the usual motions because that was what was expected of him. But, in truth, Teddy was not in a good mood at all. Everything in Teddy's body was telling him that it was time to go into hibernation. Autumn was in full swing, and this is usually the time when black bears got ready to take that long slumber. Teddy had been pacing his cage for the past week. Back and forth, looking for a way out to get to the woods where he belonged. The frustration was building up, and his owners, who usually saw him during the excitement of feeding time, didn't notice the bear's growing agitation. But for now, Teddy was seemingly happily rooting around in his pile of food. Kellyanne dragged the wheelbarrow inside with the shovel in hand, and the first few shovels of waste bedding that she hauled into the wheelbarrow went without incident. When her load was nearly overflowing, she put her shovel aside and turned to wheel the first load of mess out the door. But this sudden movement was all that Teddy needed to awaken that primal force within him. His natural instinct to protect his food, coupled with that volatile irritation that came with the need to hibernate outside in nature, just exploded out of the animal. Teddy did not see the woman who raised him, he just saw a potential threat. And with speed that belied his massive size, the beast landed on Kellyanne in one smooth bound. The air in Kelly's lungs whooshed out of her as almost 400 pounds rammed her to the ground, and by the time there was air in her lungs again to scream, Teddy had already had his jaws sunk into her shoulder. The ferocious roars and Kelly's screaming traveled to Scott's yard. He looked up with a frown that quickly turned into a look of horror when he saw the bloodbath that was unfolding in front of him. The air was alive with noise. Both his and Kelly's children were screaming hysterically. Kelly's kids had run into the house the moment the bear attacked. His enclosure was open, and they were going to be next if they didn't get out of the way fast. Scott leapt into action. It took him 30 seconds to run to his house, get his sidearm, load it, and sprint across his yard. When he reached Teddy's enclosure, Kelly was lying motionless on the ground, just a few feet from the open door. If Scott didn't know what happened, he never would have recognized the torn and broken human being that lay before him. Teddy was still on top of her. He gave the body one last shake, and when it became clear that his target was deceased, Teddy turned to the next threat before him, and that threat was Scott. The man was only a few feet away. Teddy could cover that distance in just 4 strides, but Scott was ready. The bear went low, gearing to storm at Scott on all fours, but before the beast could take 2 steps, Scott pulled the trigger, and he pulled it again and again and again. The first bullet hit Teddy in the abdomen. His thick fur and copious amounts of fat shielded him from most of the damage. It wasn't nearly enough to bring him down. Teddy recoiled from the blast, but he recovered in a split second and took a step forward. Then the second round hit him, and that was the lethal one. It hit the creature in the neck. Even without the shots that followed, that torn airway rendered his breathing obsolete. The animal hit the earth with a force that shook the ground like a freight train went past. Even the children inside the house felt the shockwave from the floorboards beneath their feet. Of the 5 shots fired, Scott managed to get 2 into the animal's skull. Even if Teddy had enough oxygen left in him for one last attack, those final rounds were more than enough to cut any remaining signs of life short instantly. And with that, 2 beings lay dead on the ground. Kellyanne, a woman who left behind 2 children and a husband who adored her, and yet now her torn and broken body lay under the canopy of the autumn rain. Forever gone from this world. A life ended in less than a minute, and the other was a majestic beast, the iconic black bear that millions of stuffed toys are modeled after. If it weren't for the screams of the children, Scott would have stared at the gruesome scene in shock for hours. Next door, Scott's kids called 911 when they heard the shots ring out, but the paramedics just arrived to remove the bodies. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. Scott and all of the children are traumatized by the events of the day. Scott can at least find solace in the fact that his actions almost certainly saved lives. If Teddy had made it out of the Walls' yard, the bear, already in a blind rage, would have attacked the first living thing that he came across. But these events did leave plenty of food for thought. How could Kelly have just left that gate wide open? Why was there no separate holding cage to keep the bear in while she cleaned? But the Walls' neighbors came to their defense. In all ways, Kellyanne did everything that the state required of an exotic keeper, and the bear was, by all accounts, tame and friendly. The fact of the matter is, no matter how young you get them, wild animals are just that, wild animals. Complacency is not a sin. Kellyanne has done this routine 1,000 times with no problems at all. Number 1001 just happened to be the perfect storm. The change in season, food to protect, and natural instincts were just the perfect recipe for disaster. So while the news spread and the world had plenty of criticism to throw at the situation, there are children who lost their mother, a husband who lost his wife, and a whole community left reeling in shock. And then there's Scott Castone, the man who did not hesitate to face down one of the biggest animals that walks on land to save his friend, his children, and the community at large. There are two lessons that we can take away from this terrible event. One is that animals belong in the wild, no matter how much we love them and even how much they love us. Natural instinct is stronger than love for the creatures that are wild. And secondly, we can celebrate the bravery of the members of our community. Scott couldn't save Kellyanne, but he did save others from being attacked. There are still heroes out there willing to put their lives on the line so others won't have to meet their terrifying final affliction. Nagano Prefecture in Japan is a scenic beauty, home to 9 of the 12 highest mountains in the country. The peaks and valleys offer spectacular alpine wilderness and national parks. Lake Kizaki, at the base of the Japanese Alps, attracts visitors to its shores to take advantage of the water sports on offer. And in the winter, skiers take to the mountains. The Japanese black bears, a subspecies of the Asian black bears, is found on Japan's 2 main islands and is thought to number around 10,000 in the whole of the country. But not all bears in Japan are wild, and not all are afforded the luxury of Japan's great mountains, ranges, and alpine meadows. 75-year-old Akira Maruyama lived with his wife down a long, narrow mountain road. His old, detached house was situated about an hour from Matsumoto City, where his daughter and her family lived. Akira didn't have many neighbors, but that suited him. He loved the outdoors and the quietness of his neighborhood. He hadn't long retired and was enjoying the slower pace of life that life in the countryside allowed for. In his younger days, he had been a hunter, but it never sat right with him, taking the life of another for the thrill of the hunt. So he laid down his gun and turned his hand to working at ironworks and civil engineering sites near Matsumoto. He was a kind-hearted man who loved animals. He could even touch wild deer if he sat still long enough behind the back of his house. He was patient and devoted to animals. He had since retired and grew rice and vegetables in his fields, living the good life and enjoying his freedom. He was still very much active in his neighborhood, regularly picking up trash and volunteering for local associations. But he shared his retired life with another individual, a bear. To those who didn't know the full story, the bear appeared to be confined to a small metal cage. The bars were rusted, the concrete slabs on the floor cracked, cold and dirty, and the tin roof flimsy. But those were just where the bear slept. Akira and his pet bear had formed a tight bond together. He considered the 20-year-old male Japanese black bear as part of the family and treated him as such. In fact, he had rescued him. The tiny bundle of fluff had been discovered on a road construction site 10 kilometers from where Akira lived. He had heard about the discovery through his civil engineering colleagues and visited the site to take a look for himself. Sure enough, the next day, the bear was still there. He must have only been a few weeks old. At about the size of a domestic house cat, the bear could barely move. The mother hadn't come back for it, and so it was either abandoned or had become separated and lost from his family. Akira knew the bear wouldn't survive much longer on its own, and so he took it in. He spent many painstaking hours trying to nurse it back to health. He fed it endless bottles of warm milk, and each time the bear would suckle, it would make a distinctive Pepe noise, and so Akira named him Pepe. When the cub regained his strength, Akira's grandchildren would come over and visit. They would wrestle with the small bear cub, rolling over and over on the grass. They could pick him up and cuddle him or chase each other around the garden. He quickly became part of the family, and Akira built the shed for him in the back garden. Although Pepe slept in there, he regularly wandered the garden and responded to the family's commands and calls. But he was growing up fast, and it wasn't long before he was mature. Akira knew he wouldn't survive in the wild, and so he applied for a license to keep it. He was granted permission, and soon people traveled from all over to see Akira and his pet bear. Children would knock on Akira's door and ask to see the bear. Their faces lit up when they saw the friendly, bumbling animal eating treats from Akira's hand or enjoying a back rub through the metal bars on his cage. Akira and Pepe's interactions were famous amongst locals. Akira fed him fruits, vegetables, and nuts, and Pepe gobbled them down gratefully. In the wild, the bears are mostly herbivorous, eating herbs and grasses in the spring before switching to berries and nuts later in the year to stock up before winter. They also consume meat and have been known to prey on wild antelope, deer, and boar. Japanese black bears are typically smaller than other species. The males grow to around 120 to 140 centimeters, 47 to 55 inches long, and weigh 60 to 120 kilograms, or 130 to 260 pounds. Despite being smaller in stature to other bears, Pepe was still incredibly strong. One day, he accidentally bit Akira's finger when he was feeding him, and Akira never made the same mistake again. From then on, he always wore leather gloves when feeding Pepe. 20 years passed with Pepe just as devoted to Akira as Akira was to him. But Akira, who had been a physically fit man all his life, was beginning to deteriorate. He had significant trouble with his lungs. He had retired from work, but was unable to fully enjoy his retirement due to his failing breathing. He carried an oxygen canister around with him wherever he went and was hooked up to it to help with his breathing. He could feel himself fading and told his family he didn't think he had long left. He wasn't the same man he used to be, but he continued to look after Pepe as he had always done. He was like a son to him. On the morning of November 28, 2022, however, something happened to Akira that cannot be fully explained. His daughter came to collect his wife to take her for a hospital appointment when she found Akira slumped on the ground of Pepe's cage. She raced outside and knelt by his side. He had a faint pulse and his breathing was shallow. He was unresponsive. Pepe sat munching some ginkgo nuts from a bucket left outside the cage. The door was open and Pepe showed no signs of aggression, but Akira was covered in blood. It pooled down the concrete slab all around him. Cuts, scratches, and bite marks covered his body. His daughter immediately called emergency services and Akira was raced to hospital. Sadly, he died a short while later. But what had happened? Had his trusted companion turned on him after 20 years together? Or was Pepe trying to play with Akira? As winter was approaching, Pepe may have been ravenous, stocking up on food to build fat reserves for the cold months ahead. He had devoured almost the entire bucket of nuts Akira had brought out for him. Maybe he had become overexcited when he smelt the food and had lunged at Akira. Even though he was only 1 meter long and weighed 80 kilograms, Pepe would have easily floored Akira, especially with his failing health. He was no match for the bear, and each and every bite was a devastating blow for the devoted owner. He could feel the power behind the strikes, the sharp sensation of Pepe's teeth biting into his flesh, and the slashes of the long claws. Perhaps Pepe had been over-playful with Akira and had jumped at him. He had been used to wrestling with the family over the years and could be boisterous. But as Akira lost his strength over the recent years, he was no longer able to play with Pepe as he once did. Later, a member from the local hunting club came and shot the bear. Akira's family was devastated on both counts. They had lost Akira, a devoted father, husband, and grandfather who was looking forward to retirement and spending time with his growing family. And they had lost Akira's longtime companion, the unique and playful Pepe, whom they had all known since he was a few weeks old. Akira's family didn't hold a grudge against Pepe. They knew he was very strong and that he may have playfully knocked Akira around. He didn't know his own strength, and they treated the death as an accident. They used a digger to dig a large hole for Pepe in the backyard. When news of the tragedy spread, neighbors came to pay their respects. They lit incense and lay flowers and apples on top of the upturned soil, a sign of respect for Pepe, a local celebrity who, just like Akira, met his terrifying final affliction.